Welcome to Business Infrastructure, the podcast about curing back office blues of fast-growing businesses. If you're a business owner or operator looking for practical tips and solutions to scaling your business in a sustainable manner, you're in the right place. Now here's your hostess, Alicia Butler-Pierre.
People panic when they aren't prepared. That came from a recent text my good friend Gary Voss sent me. He's a cybersecurity expert, and we were having an exchange about COVID-19, also known as the coronavirus. As of this recording, most of the world is either on forced or self-quarantine as we anxiously await the moment when this virus will have peaked and a vaccine is in place. But it brings me to the point and the topic of what I'd like to share with you today. Disaster comes in many forms. It could be weather-related, the death of someone close to you, or of someone who is an integral part of your team. It could be a rogue employee that could take down your entire operation. Disaster can also come in the form of theft, fire, a mass shooting, even a pandemic. Hi there, I'm Alicia, and today I'm going to share with you a challenge that I had to work through that involved a natural disaster and the impact that it had on my business. But first, this 90th episode marks the last of season 7, which had a focus on being the boss, the good, the bad, and the ugly. 12 different CEOs of small businesses came on to talk in detail about a particular challenge that they worked through that jeopardized the success of their business. They each described how they used business infrastructure to work through that challenge with a stronger, better business as a result. Now, if this is your first time listening, business infrastructure is a system for linking your people, processes, and tools to ensure that growth happens in a profitable and sustainable way. Now, if you have been with me for a while, you know that with each season, I close with a monologue. And in this monologue, I want to share again, a very personal story with you. I don't know if I've ever shared this much detail of this story publicly, but as I record this monologue again, we are faced with a virus the COVID-19 virus, which at this point has taken the lives of thousands of people. So the story that I'm about to share is fitting considering the time. Now, if you don't know, I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, here in the U.S., and preparing for hurricanes, honestly, is a natural part of life, just as people in London prepare for snow. No matter where we are in the world, there is some type of natural phenomena that we just learn to deal with. Now, Baton Rouge is about 60 miles from New Orleans, and as many of you know, New Orleans is below sea level, making it highly susceptible to flooding, but Baton Rouge isn't. So when a friend started calling me back in late August 2016 about excessive rain, I really didn't think anything of it. August is during the hurricane season, so initially my thoughts were, so what? It's rain. It always rains. It's hurricane season. Who cares? And I remember our exchange going something like this. My friend was trying to tell me, she said, but I'm telling you, this is different. The rain isn't stopping. It has been raining nonstop for 3 days, literally no break in the rain. Check on your parents. And I remember her telling me that she would call them, but she was so busy making her own rounds trying to get in touch with all of her family. So I took her advice. I called my parents, and they told me that everything was fine. And I remember that being on a Thursday afternoon. And I'd soon learned that everything was not fine. By the next day on Friday, my friend's phone calls became more frequent and increased in urgency with each particular message. And she also started sending me links to different news clips and articles from the Baton Rouge area. Different areas of the city were actually starting to flood, and it was flooding very badly. And a few hours after that, my phone became inundated with notifications from an app that one of my younger cousins had recently added a lot of us to, and that is the GroupMe app. And while I was trying to sort through all of these messages and notifications that were coming onto my phone, I was able to figure out that one of my cousins had water coming into her home. And we all started pleading with her to make sure she got out and get out as quickly as possible. Now, having lived in New Orleans, I knew that once a street is covered with water, the water has nowhere else to go but up. And let me tell you, water rises very fast. So that particular cousin left her home, and then one by one, different family members started reporting that water was coming into their homes. Now, by Friday night, my parents still reported that everything was fine where they lived. So the next morning comes, Saturday morning. I checked in again with my parents before I met a friend for lunch. And again, my mother told me that although it was raining a lot, everything was okay. Don't worry. This particular area of the city is not impacted. But by noon, I'm at the restaurant with my friend, and again, I started noticing that my phone was lighting up with all of these notifications from that GroupMe app. And let me just, a quick aside, I have to tell you, if it were not for that GroupMe app, I would have been completely disconnected from all of my friends and family back home in Louisiana. So here's something that happens with hurricanes. You definitely will lose electricity. You can also lose the ability to have running water. But cell phone tower coverage is just very spotty. So we always like to think that we have these electrical tools at our disposal. But when a natural disaster like that hits or strikes, you lose that ability to communicate. But for some reason, we were able to communicate through text and through the GroupMe app. So a shout out to my cousin Ashley for adding all of us to that GroupMe app. It ended up being a true blessing in disguise. So anyway, back to the story. One message in particular, as I'm again scrolling through all of these messages coming through on my phone, was this. Something to the effect of Aunt Sheila and Uncle Sidney are going to a shelter at a school. I'm like, what? Sheila and Sidney, those are my parents. They were talking about my parents. So I knew that could only mean one thing, that water must have started coming into my parents' house. I tried to call their home line, no answer. I called each of their cell phones, no answer. At that point, I didn't have more details, but I knew it had to be bad for them to leave home. Now, without making this story too long, suffice it to say that I later learned that my parents escaped 3 different locations before they finally found safety and shelter. And at one point, they were on a boat, and they were in serious danger of that boat capsizing because the current from the water was just that strong. And for those of you listening, another very frightening thing that can happen whenever there's a flood in southern Louisiana in particular, are the threat of reptiles. So you have snakes, alligators in the water, and everything is just being washed up and washed away. So it's a very frightening thing. Now, fast forward a few weeks after that, I drove to my parents' home from Louisiana. I drove to my parents' home from Atlanta. And my plan was to be there for a week because I was in the middle of wrapping up a very big project for a large client that I had. But I knew I needed to get to them as quickly as possible to help sort through things. And honestly, we were in a race against the clock to battle the mold. So it's in August, Louisiana is very hot, it's very humid. So it wasn't so much the flood damage itself as much as it was the threat of mold and mildew starting to spread. Now, going back to that large corporate client that I was working with, one of their executives, unfortunately, had absolutely no mercy and grew angry when I was unable to ghostwrite an email for him to send to the company's CEO. But little did he know, I actually didn't have access to email at that time because, again, there was no cell phone coverage. Wi-Fi was pretty much an impossibility. So when he finally was able to get through to me, he was very angry, even though, mind you, he knew that I was in a very serious situation, in a crisis, helping out my parents. I told him that the nearest place that I knew of that had Wi-Fi was at least 25 miles away. It was at a public library that still happened to be open in the area. And he said, okay, well, I'll expect you to write that email on my behalf, within the next 2 hours. So that meant I had to drop everything that I was doing, working on, helping my parents with. And I drove to the library, and I'll never forget this because I was in such a frenzy. And I parked my car at the library, got out of the car, and I just happened to look down at my pants, and they were smeared with black mold. So I got out of the car and went on into the library, drafted up the email. But at that moment, I couldn't even be angry. I was just more stunned at this person's reaction and his treatment of me, considering the circumstances, than anything. But at that moment, I knew what I had to do. I knew what I had to do. I was going to have to do business differently. On my return drive back to Atlanta, I had a lot of time to think, and it's amazing how some alone time can really get your creative juices flowing. I had toyed around with the idea of going completely remote with my business, but then I thought, well, maybe it would be better if I could figure out a way to use a combination of digital as well as in-person tools as much as possible. And I intentionally began expanding my team to consist of in-person resources as well as outsourced resources across the world, all in an effort to minimize risk. That way, I figured if disaster happened to strike in Atlanta, the odds of it also happening in Ghana at the same time were slim. But even a pandemic, I must admit, can challenge that theory. But using this type of business model would also increase my company's operational capacity, not to mention my personal bandwidth. So the more that I could stay at home, work from home, and outsource as much as possible and work as remotely as possible, it would definitely add to more time in my day, which again would increase my personal bandwidth. But this also allowed me to remove any geographic restrictions, because when I first started my company, I could only work with other companies in the Atlanta area. But now I'm able to work with companies literally around the world. So although I was really pissed off at what that particular executive at this client had said to me and had done to me, rather than steeped in anger and the fear of the unknown, I sprang into action. I completed my obligation to this client. He sang my praises, but in the background, I have to be honest with you, I made a vow to myself that I would never create an environment where someone felt comfortable disrespecting me, not if I could help it. Another thing I should mention is proof is everything during a crisis, and documentation can serve you well should you find yourself battling with insurance companies, vendors, etc. in the aftermath of a disaster. Now, thankfully, prior to my parents escaping their home, my mother actually grabbed a handheld safe where she kept important documents, things like the will and trust, passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, insurance policies, car titles, the deed to the house, and all kinds of other important information that she could actually fit into this. It's kind of like in the shape of a briefcase. Because here's the thing. When a flood, and it's not just a flood, it could also be a fire. It could be theft. But when that physical paperwork is no longer around or accessible for whatever reason, you've lost your ability to prove ownership of your home, to prove ownership of a car, to prove that you have access to certain things. I happened to bring a scanner with me to my parents' house, and I started scanning all of the paperwork that my mother had in that safe, and I stored the digital copies in multiple locations, including the cloud. We then installed a VPN as an added layer of security. Now, fast forward again in time, that was in 2016. The following year, I actually spent the entire summer of 2017 with them, helping them to rebuild not only their home, but their lives as well, and so that they could return to a sense of normalcy as quickly as possible. Now, on my return drive to Atlanta from that summer break, I hired a marketing consultant, and he encouraged me to write a book. And I'll never forget it. He said, "Oh, it'll take you about 30 days. Yeah, you can get a book done in about 30 days." Well, 30 days turned into 11 months, my friends. But I must say this, the finished product was well worth it because I had yet another quote unquote insurance policy to ensure that my life's work was not lost to disaster. Looking back on it, I actually went without steady income. And when I say steady income, I mean pretty much no income for over a year as a result of helping my parents as well as working on my book. But it was a worthy sacrifice. And it's kind of like what Marco Champion said in episode 80. When you're at your lowest point, all you have to work with is your mind. These experiences made not only myself and my business, but my parents stronger. Their house looks better than ever before. My book has made the Amazon bestseller list twice. I started a popular podcast, and my consulting business is thriving. Now let's talk solutions. Listen, I get it. No one likes to think of doom and gloom, but it's better to be prepared than caught off guard. As entrepreneurs and executives, we have a particular resilience that lends itself well to leading through crisis. I now want to share with you 3 tools that I've used in my business as well as for my clients that can help you get on the path of developing contingency plans that not only minimize risk, but also protect your most mission-critical workflows. The first one that I want to share with you is called the FMEA, and that stands for Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. This is actually a Lean Six Sigma / process improvement tool. And all it is, it's basically an Excel spreadsheet, and it's an exercise to actually help you and your team brainstorm all of the weak links or failure points in a particular process. And once you identify those weak links, you can then develop a course of action to either eliminate them altogether or reduce the severity of their effect. Incredibly useful and powerful tool, especially when you know that your process is susceptible to basically breaking down and failing. The second tool that I want to share with you is called the pre-mortem. So opposite of a post-mortem, obviously, and definitely used in a business context. And I actually first heard about this from an executive that I worked with several years ago. He mentioned that he had read about it in a Harvard Business Review article, and I was really curious about it. And what I noticed is that whereas an FMEA is usually performed on a process level, the pre-mortem is performed on a project level or overall organization level. And it's an exercise to also help you as well as your project team or core leadership team. Imagine that a project or the business itself has actually failed for whatever reason, and you would then work backwards to figure out the root causes of those failures. And again, in doing so, it helps you understand how you can tighten up certain aspects of the company overall or a particular project. The last tool is the disaster recovery and business continuity plan. Now, I recommend that you take the results from the FMEA as well as the pre-mortem exercises and roll those action items into what's called a disaster recovery and business continuity plan. No, disaster recovery and business continuity are not the same thing, but they definitely go hand in hand. Disaster recovery simply refers to the different steps that you take to prevent disaster or the loss of data or continuity altogether within your business. The business continuity plan actually details all of the backup plans that you have in place to initiate once disaster prevents you from doing business as usual or business as normal. So, for example, the disaster recovery part of the plan may say, well, you know what? There is the possibility that if we, for whatever reason, lose electricity for a certain period of time in the business, we know that we have generators or we have a mobile trailer where we could set up generators to actually continue working, so that our servers can continue working and we can continue to access data for our clients, and there would be no discontinuity in our operation. So that's kind of the difference between the disaster recovery side as well as the business continuity. I hope that makes sense. Now, combined, I call the three of these tools your business immunity kit. And every business should have one, regardless of size or industry. Not only does this business immunity kit serve as a powerful antibody to stave off the dangers of declining revenue that can occur during and after a disaster, but it also serves as a catalyst if your business needs to increase bandwidth during a disaster. Remember, not everybody has the threat of losing business during or after a disaster or crisis. A lot of companies actually see a surge in demand and they actually can't keep up with, they actually need more capacity. They need to increase their bandwidth. Now, some other resources that I recommend include a crisis communication plan template. And I actually saw this on a website called You Inc. And I actually, as soon as I saw it, I immediately downloaded it, sent it to one of my clients, and they were so grateful because they were able to use it right away. And I'll make sure that I have a link to that same template for you in the show notes at businessinfrastructure.tv. Another resource that I'd like to share with you is my book. No shameless plug here. I definitely want to plug the book because it's so applicable to trying to get in place a specific plan of action for disaster recovery. And that is, my book is called Behind the Facade, How to Structure Company Operations for Sustainable Success. Specifically look at chapters 4 and 5 because it includes stories about one company that suffered from a natural disaster and the other company actually suffers from a malicious virus that attacked their entire network and compromised all of their customer data. So I detail very specifically the things that they did in place to mitigate, but also how they put in place a disaster recovery and business continuity plan. So basically leveraging different elements of this business immunity kit that I just described. Another book that I highly recommend, and it's more on the, I guess you would say, metaphysical side, but it's called Write It Down, Make It Happen, and it's by Henriette Ann Clouser. And I think this book is so important because sometimes we get stuck in our creative process. We get so caught up in the fear and the panic and the drama of the crisis itself that we often need to just take even if it's just a few minutes, take some time aside, really meditate, and that's when you can start figuring out creative solutions to a problem that you may be facing as a result of a disaster. I also recommend Silke Glob's meditation therapy services. Silke was actually a guest on the podcast a couple of seasons back, as well as an online class by Latarsha Horn called Master Your Emotions. I'll make sure I have links again to all of these resources online at businessinfrastructure.tv. If I had to sum up my advice when it comes to rebounding after disaster, it's this. Have a balance of analog and digital solutions at all times. Don't become too dependent on one or the other. Have a combination of both to the best extent you can. Don't panic. It's like they say, when you're thrown into a pool of water and you don't know how to swim, the fear and the panic is what will cause you to drown. Documentation and communication can be your two greatest assets in leading through a crisis. Here's a really important one. Show empathy and watch how your people will pull together and help brainstorm solutions. Dr. Maya Angelou said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." I also strongly encourage you to listen to the cautionary tales of each guest this season. They've all rebounded and came out on the other side of their situation stronger, sharing the resources they leveraged along the way. Now, there's about 4 themes that I noticed with our guests this season. 1, beware of partnerships. While Phoebe Cornog and Keith Scott had success stories when it comes to partnerships, Dr. Lawena Bayer and Jason Duncan shared cautionary tales of what can happen when theft of time and money is involved in a partnership. A second theme that I've noticed, scaling back to scale up. Yes, you can grow too fast, and Mike Mall and Dr. Terica Pearson both gave us great examples of how this happened in their businesses and what they did to specifically rebound from those experiences. Third thing, pivot and niche, or niche, however you want to pronounce that word. You don't have to wait for a disaster or a crisis to cause you to change directions in your business. Meredith Moore didn't wait, and although it took a lot of resources to pull it off, her business and her new clientele are reaping the benefits. And Chitra Lele started her own firm after she got blacklisted from a prominent Silicon Valley company. And fourth and lastly, fight for your cause. Marco Champion, Carla Nelson, and Don Sevcik each had to take a hiatus from their life's work, whether forced or, because they realized it was something they need to do. But the point is, none of them gave up. They refused to give up. And when Bill Shepard couldn't find a certain peer-to-peer group that he was looking for, he went ahead and created his own. You've come this far in your entrepreneurial journey. Don't let disaster and crisis stop you. Rebounding might mean changing your business model, scaling back, or even temporarily abandoning some products and services and shifting to something else. The point is, you can and will recover. It just might not look like it did before the disaster or the crisis. No business is immune from disaster. Definitely not 100% immune from disaster. Things will happen, but better to be prepared than not. If you have specific questions about any of the information I shared, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Just search for me at Alicia Butler Pierre, and Pierre is spelled P like Paul, I-E-R-R-E, and send me a direct message. You can also request a one-on-one personalized phone consultation with me by going to businessinfrastructure.tv. And while you're at that website, you can also access the show notes where I'll provide links to all of the resources I mentioned in today's episode. Just look for episode 90. And please note that the Business Immunity Kit as well as the video tutorial will both be available after April 2nd, 2020. Again, after April 2nd, 2020. Season 8 will officially kick off next week, and I am so excited. If you'll recall, back in episode 89, Bill Shepard introduced the role of the person in charge of keeping your business's engine running, the Chief Operating Officer. And Season 8 will actually be dedicated exclusively to learning more about COOs and the value they offer. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Dr. Dennis Kimbrough, one of my mentors and the author of The Wealth Choice. Every adversity carries with it the seed of an equivalent or a greater benefit. You become better, bigger, more successful each time you meet and overcome an obstacle.
Thank you for listening to Business Infrastructure, the podcast about curing back office blues with Alicia Butler-Pierre. If you like what you've heard, do us a favor and subscribe, leave a rating and review, and more importantly, share with your colleagues and team members who could benefit from the information. Join us next week for another episode of Business Infrastructure with Alicia Butler-Pierre.